she writes stories for her siblings. And one of her siblings is here, Sarah. So thank you for coming, Sarah. And then Nancy Yorka, who's helped me put this on, and I thank her very much. She is writing as, okay, so even though you wrote how to say it, is it Bo?
Yeah, you'll see on my book, it's written by Anna Blake Goodboe. And just to explain that really quick, that is my middle and my maiden name, and Blake is my grandmother's name, the one that I just read Corn Soap from. I was a teacher in the district, in District 20 for several years. I wanted to keep my writing life separate from my teaching life. I didn't want like scrutiny from the Board of Education. Going, we got one of these wild ones. You just never know. So anyhow, it fit my style of writing a whole lot better than my surname and my married name. So I just stuck with it, and it flowed into the style of poetry in my brand, so to speak.
So she has been writing poetry, and as she said, she's a retired teacher. She kind of introduced herself. She's been a writing judge for Women Writing in the West, Colorado Independent Publishers Association, and the Oklahoma Federation of Writers, and she has also helped judge elementary school poetry here in our school district. And she's going to do that next week, actually, again. And then our last panelist is Loring Orville, who brought the chapbooks and other books up there. And he's the president of Poetry West. It's a poets community serving Southern Colorado, all of Southern Colorado. And he's also served as group content director for United Business Media in London. They are all members of our small writing group. We have other members here, so thank you all for coming too to support this. And they're just going to talk about poetry, self-publishing a little bit, and just kind of writing in general, and how the world would view poetry.
Oh, local connection to support what Chris had to say. I also served as the coach and judge for the Monument D38 High School, Lewis Palmer High School, not Ridge, slam team.
Oh, great.
This year and last year. So
okay, super.
Yes, all of our high schools have slam teams.
Oh,
oh, I didn't know LP had one. That's
great. So, thank you all for doing this.
I don't know. That's good to know. So one of the things that we want to talk about in getting poetry like to you, because poetry as we know it, it varies in each one of us and what that meaning is. And coming from my teaching background and being so exposed to poetry, I'm here to tell you I didn't care for it in high school, and now I'm not alone in that. I know I'm not alone in that. And it is said that we lose the voice of poetry in high school. And so we come back at it later on in our adult life, and in a different way, in a different viewpoint and outlook than what we did in high school. And I remember one night having a poetry evening at my elementary school, and parents sat there, and then they were starting to look bored, but it was their children that were in the spotlight. And I saw, you know how you get a feeling when something's like sliding, a slippery slope, it was going there, and I felt real bad for the kids, so I stopped it, and I said to parents, I go, you haven't been to anything poetic or read any poetry since high school, and you hated it then. And they were like, oh yeah, that was really a great icebreaker. And so in order to understand and getting someone to appreciate, or getting ourselves to appreciate the written word, even the ones that you heard tonight, is not always an easy thing, because it's all set into a structure sitting in a book, an academic book or something. How many of us would love, just to be able to read it just for the sake of enjoyment, or even writing it? Whether we observe something, we feel something, we do something. So that's what we want to talk about tonight, the three of us. And I wanted Christine up here because she's part of our writing group, but she's also got the young voice. How old are you now?
18.
She's 18. So at 18, I was in a freshman year of college, and we were just coming out of learning about poetry through music of the 60s, Simon and Garfunkel, Joan Baez, Judy Collins. That was my exposure to poetry in high school, along with Robert Frost, Carl Sandburg, and all of those. So I wanted her to get in on this and have that discussion with us. So that's what, our panel, I want to have it, interactive. This is a good group that's here tonight, and thank you all for coming. But you must have a feeling about poetry one way or another. And, where do you want to begin with that, Lauren?
Well, okay, I'll start with a couple of things. One observation about performance poetry and one on kind of page poetry, printed poetry. At the time of the second Obama inauguration, when the former poet laureate read a poem, LA Times did a blog piece that said, "Is poetry dead?" And it was kind of silly to begin with, but I thought, based on everything I'm seeing in Colorado, there's, particularly Denver and Colorado Springs, there's at least one slam or open mic event a week. And this has burgeoned out of a very low base just in the last 2 years. So you could legitimately call it some kind of a renaissance or something. A lot of arts tend to move in 25, 30-year cycles. And slam poetry, somebody had asked a question about that, really was in its full-fledged glory mid to late 80s. And slam is actually a competitive sport, if you will, because it's a 3-minute, memorized in most cases, kind of event with a lot of performance attached to it. And then it just kind of faded away after a while, and it came back big time to the point where last week, the Here Here Slam finals in town were at Stargazer Center the night of the big blizzard, and it was 2/3 full, along with fire eaters and belly dancers and everything else. A year or so ago, we went to the Women's International Slam Finals in Denver, and there were 800 people in the Museum of Art there. And I'm thinking, this person can ask if poetry is dead? I mean, when I'm seeing a resurgence nationwide like I've never seen. And I think part of that is the fact there is a Master of Fine Arts poetocracy cloistered, almost like, the nuns and the monks back in the old days, where the people of academia kind of remain separated from a lot of this street poetry activity going on. And it's like somebody immersing themselves in classic rock and not being aware there's a universe of hip-hop and electronica and everything else around them. And so I think only people who choose to keep their eyes closed can fail to see the street poetry everywhere around them. The related topic about printed poetry is that, for the big publishers, Random House, Viking, poetry, short stories, etc., have never been a big profit margin business anyway. But they are just kind of flailing around trying to figure out what to do about e-publishing, self-publishing, publish on demand, etc. that has come out in the last few years, because it really represents the death knell of a lot of jobs like literary agent job and publishing job. Chapbooks are nothing new to the poetry world. They've been around since mid-20th century. But the idea of self-publishing, veered right into the idea of do-it-yourself, independent music, desktop publishing, online publishing, all this. So it jived and fit perfectly. And nowadays the publishers are going, well, if everybody just gets poetry books published on CreateSpace or some kind of online thing, where's the vetting? Where's the editorial judgment process that goes on? But really, they're facing the same thing that the journalism community faced about 5 or 10 years ago, where, citizens just come in with podcasts and blogs and tweets and YouTube video postings and make the entire TV news and newspaper business irrelevant overnight. And it's interesting to note that publishers are facing this now, and Publishers Weekly just had this, slip sleeve cover talking about who will save our books, our bookstores, our libraries, what will happen to American literature. Asking these questions is the equivalent to residents of Queens Canyon and Mountain Shadows going, gosh, isn't that Waldo Canyon fire dangerous? What do you think we ought to do about it? Which way do you think we ought to go? The wildfire will come down and sweep through the traditional publishing industry as surely as it swept through journalism. And the only thing publishers can do is keep out of the way as this self-generated, do-it-yourself industry just blossoms around them. Because whether or not they have a legitimate point about judgment and vetting of poetry works, short story works, there's nothing they can do about their own obsolescence. They're just going to be wiped out. And so what we have to do here as kind of street poets, self-published poets, from the ground up poets, is be there when the fires wipe everything else out. Which is a lesson, of course, for bookstore owners too. I mean, it's like, how do you confront that? It's a toughie. You know?
Can those publishing houses integrate themselves somehow into this new market?
Smart ones try to. I mean, they have ebook, divisions and everything. The problem is, it's always a little too late. And like I said, with the journalism industry, you can see in newspapers and CNN and all these things trying belatedly to get into iReporters and tweets. They're always too late for what is going on. And I see Amazon's on time. Amazon with CreateSpace is on time. I don't see anything out of Harper, Random, anybody that is in a timely fashion. It's kind of a day late.
Can they not necessarily go in, not integrate with the idea of still being who they've always been, but befriend the authors who are getting started?
Well, last week in the New York Times there was a front page article about authors best-selling authors that chose to self-publish because they thought they got a better deal. And so it's not even the publishing companies being in control anymore. It's now the authors are taking control, and the publishing companies have to kind of follow them along. But at any rate, I don't want to make this into just a two-way or anything else. I wanted to make sure Christine had a voice, and then Nancy had some more follow-up on all this too, as well. So.
Well, one of the reasons, I mean,
We're talking about poetry.
yeah, and
Getting out of it.
right. What I just read a recent article, just an article this afternoon, is that poetry belongs to people, to the people. It doesn't belong sitting in a university. But our first exposure is usually in an academic situation, and whether it's in high school or college or whatever. But it has become like so academic oriented that it sits there in its own little group, its own little tight community, and the everyday person is not getting or even creating their own a poetic voice for having something to say, but they're not getting exposed to good voices or whatever. It's not getting out there. And this particular poet, who's, I guess, she had said that when Lori had mentioned the MFA is the Master of Fine Arts in poetry, it is sitting there in its downhill vacuum, as she put it. One of our main purpose, and Tommy and Paula were the ones that get the credit for creating this evening. And it was their idea to have a poetry night in readings and discussion, and getting it out to everyday people like us that, we're not sitting in a classroom at a college having this discussion. We're in a small town here. And so what does the poetic word mean to you? I mean, we had Chris's performance poetry, what he did. Your beautiful poem, your poems from, Poetry West, and a few from the book. But, is this something you can connect with? I asked that question even as a writer, can my work or anything that you heard, does it connect to you as an audience member? Your poem about being a grandfather, said and done, simple, we could connect with it. Maureen, your poem that you wrote, that you did, I saw it all because I've been to Iona, Scotland, where, it's like the bedrock of Celtic Christianity, and you nailed it on the head, right on, but I had no idea that was on the coast of Spain.
I didn't either.
Okay, so, there's always things that you're going to learn about. Even back in elementary school, exposing children to poetry and rich language sets precedence of what they're going to do later on. When I taught my students, it was always that boxed-in thing that you have to rhyme no matter what.
I was taught that growing up.
Yeah, you always have to rhyme, and they were always cautious of getting lockstep into the rhyming patterns, and that's fine. But it also discouraged them because a lot of children didn't understand what that rhyme was, and they had something else that they had wanted to say. Rhyming is great in songwriting. I mean, where else does it go? And you don't rhyme in yours, and I blew that theory. So, don't you love my friends? I love my friends.
Some songs rhyme.
A lot of songs. But
so how do you get people to overcome their intimidation?
Right.
I mean, obviously the three of you have somehow overcome that. Not everybody, and I was kind of wondering is, you see poems are usually, this black and white format in a book. And it's kind of hard sometimes to get, the image that you're trying to get across. And, and some of those more technically oriented is, I'm not creative.
Right.
I know math, I know science, but how do you overcome? How did you get started in poetry? Is probably for all three of you.
Well, like for me, the first exposures I had to poetry was when I was in elementary school. Not that long ago. I'm only 18, but. I was always taught, you had to have the specific meter, and you had to put, a metaphor here and a simile here, and you had to make, every line or every other line rhyme and all this stuff. And it really crushed my creativity for a few years, because at first, I couldn't write that way, because I don't think that's how the creative process starts out. I think that you have to start out just free writing whatever comes into your head. You see something and a few words come to your head, and you just write them down and go from there. And but I was taught very specific, very rigid in forms of writing in both poetry and in other writing, and I absolutely despised it. But I've always been very musical as well, and I think music started to open me up a little bit towards poetry, because the lyrics of songs, like you said, are so poetic. Some of them not so much, but so many songs are so poetic. And I just started to, you just start to, like I said, just free write and just write out whatever thoughts come into your head, even if it's just a tiny, tiny bit. And that's how I started out, just a tiny bit. And it doesn't come out right the first time. You just have to keep on pushing and pushing and pushing and forcing yourself to do something that you hate to do. And a big part of it is reading good books, like Nancy's book. It's amazing. Just saying.
Thank you.
And one of my favorites is Robert Frost, but just a bunch of people, Ted Koozer's another good one. But just if you read a type of writing, it gets ingrained into your head, and then you can start to write that way. So if you are reading poetry, which really poetry is just prose, condensed, majorly condensed. So if you start reading poetry and even just reading good books that aren't poetry, you learn how to write more creatively simply because you're putting those words into yourself. And it might take a while, but it comes eventually if you put enough of it into yourself and practice enough.
So how would you reach, in today's world, they don't even look at each other, walking down the street with their smartphones, texting,
Falling into fountain.
and they'll do ebooks or, how do you reach someone, to read a good book? I mean, people don't buy books, that's the trend. I mean, particularly like, more so, your generation is smartphones, tweets, 140 characters or less,
Yeah.
Instagram.
Well, the thing is, I've always been an old soul a little bit. I don't have a smartphone. I call this my dumb phone. It's actually starting to break down, but I love it. I'm on Facebook, but I don't ever use it. So maybe I'm not the best person to ask about that. But you can still read good books through the internet and through ebooks and stuff. You can, sometimes I post poetry on Facebook or something. You can still get people to read it through electronic sources. They just have to read the right books. Because even if you are reading physical books, you still have to sort through all the junk to find the really good literature.
Also, a lot of the kids today watch shows like Jon Stewart, which I've gotten into, and Colbert. They're funny politically, but they have authors. Every night or every other night, the guest is an author. And through watching I watch shows to see who the author is and what the books are about, and it's brought me into different areas of reading that I would not be. Because I want to hear from the author. I can't read in the New York Times best-selling list, this book. No, what the hell is it about? And I'm finding that the kids today are into that. Yeah, they're into their iPhones and their iPads and all that other stuff. But I can't knock this younger generation out as I can't. And also, I think education. Nancy, you've spoken about education. Somehow, you people have to get into the schools and start changing the way things have been done over the last 100 years or whatever it is. And I think by going as a visiting author, contacting the librarian and saying, hey, suppose I come in and do, because as a librarian, they do these kinds of classes. And I think that's where it's at.
When you see the energy of the slam teams at the high school level,
That
You're
reminded
just-
me of the Beatniks.
it's just amazing to see the self-generated
Yes.
creativity arising. The problem, in one level, is with teachers who are afraid to present without a framework. I mean, myself, I grew up being a music nut from age 5, and then learning with very little, school support that I liked something along the lines of Cummings and Eliot and that kind of stuff, and then growing from there. But a kid's poetry session just a couple weeks ago at Cottonwood reminded me of that, because the teachers had not taught rhyming poetry, but they wanted the style of conversant poetry where a kid would come up and say, backpack, beautiful backpack, beautiful heavy backpack. And the first poem you hear is great. The 12th poem you hear, you go, they really have got to get out of that. Right? And I think it's because
I know
the
the curriculum
teachers,
where that came from.
yeah, exactly. The teacher's fear of a framework-less method of teaching creative expository writing, like Christine was talking about. That's just there's too much. too less of control. But you take those kind of methods, and it's like learning to draw farm animals by drawing a big circle and a little circle, and that equals a pig, you know, or whatever. You're not going to get any kind of creativity that way. But what you mentioned, and the idea of bringing kids in, which they do to the downtown slams, and kids, I'm talking middle school, high school age kids, a lot of the teachers will do that. That gives them, you know, one-on-one
Yes.
ideas of what creativity is.
I think also your self-publishing is smart.
Yeah.
And I understand that, you know, things are going to change, but it's smart because it's getting your work out. Where it may not have gotten out if you had to wait around for a publisher.
One of the things as a teacher, I changed my way of teaching writing when I became a writer. Looking at the curriculum, I couldn't do it anymore. And so I had to ask myself, would I like to be taught this? Okay? No. I don't even like teaching it, let alone receiving it. And I saw huge differences in my students in their writing ability, whether they were learning disabled or regular education students, that once I approached it as a writer in my teaching, I saw amazing things happen. The curriculum guide was put away. What you talk about, backpack, big pack, okay. And I can tell you the actual name of the curriculum where that came from, because they grow on a noun and an adjective, and then line 3 add 2 more adjectives, and then, you know, what are you saying here? Oh, let's put a period at the end of it, and, you know, let's call it writing. And then there is the Common Core standards that are happening now nationwide. There, as you know, the standardized testing, and the poems that are on a standardized test, believe it or not, are our classic poems. And as many CSAPs I administered, there was always Fog by Carl Sandburg. There was always Stopping by the Woods by Robert Frost, all those classic, and the kids would look at it and go, we didn't talk about this in class. They didn't teach, you know, they didn't teach us. But as far as, you know, who's reading what and who's getting what, maybe Tommy, you could address that as a bookstore owner. And Paula, you know, like what's your audience there at your bookstore? I mean, do you have a lot of young kids? Do you have middle age? I mean, you know, you could probably address that better than I can.
Our customers are a lot of young moms and dads with small children, and as they grow up, then we seem to have a gap that if those parents are not big readers themselves, we sort of lose both the kids and the parents for a while. But then the adults come back to the store. We've seen a big increase in just the past year or so of the number of shoppers that we have. So we have, but we do still have some high school, college-age kids that come in, but they are the ones that have it in their souls that they love books. They're also the ones that, without fail, every week we hear say, you know, I have a Kindle or I have an e-reader and I just don't like reading on it. I really like to hold a book. We have so many of those, and I'm serious, every week we have a couple of people say that to us. So that's becoming, you know, we have not fought the e-reader phase. It's technology, it's happening, because I don't think you can fight it in the first place. But I don't think there's a need to fight it, because I think there will always be a place for new technology. I think e-readers for people who are traveling are probably wonderful things, because you can take 12 books with you and you don't have to pack them in a pack with you in the big, heavy backpack.
Big, heavy backpack.
So we have a lot of that, but you know, it's funny, as you were talking about poetry being popular, unpopular at different ages. Paul and I were having the conversation just today that for very young children learning to read, or for elementary school children who are needing some help with reading, poetry is a way to teach reading, because it helps with the pronunciation, it helps with the putting the emphasis on the right syllable, and it helps with it's just a really great way, and that's why really young children love poetry, because they think they can read even if they really can't read. So I think it's a developmental situation with people that as very young children we probably all loved poetry, whether or not we remember it. And then somehow as we got older and were reading real books, we went away from poetry, and it's hard to get back as an adult to saying, can I really appreciate that form of literature again? Because it's not the poetry that you liked as a child. It is a free form. It is something else. And it's not only hard to decide that we like it as readers. We do not sell books of poetry, I have to tell you, and most bookstores don't sell very much poetry, because people have come away from that, and they are not used to reading a whole story in a poem form.
There's an opportunity that's lost, though, I think. And here's what I see. When somebody like a Susie Q. Smith or a Seth Walker comes to a slam, and they are so exciting, and their work, only $5, only $10, is really cool handmade stuff. And so people snap it up as an artifact that means something. And I see an analogy. You know, the independent music stores in the last 5 years have gone bonkers over Record Store Day, which is the day when special editions of vinyl records come in for one day only. And people are lined up 5 blocks down the road to go to a record store. And I think that if independent book distributors were to say, hey, we've only got 5 copies of Jake Adam York's Murmur poetry book coming in here, you'd have people lining up to get the special precious artifact, because it wasn't just something that was mass-produced by Random House. It was some special chapbook you're not going to see 2 years from now. And if they can get that magical connection, when they go to a slam, they know what the connection is. They see somebody like a Tatiana Brown or a Seth Walker who's magical, and then they want to buy the book. And if they can start making that connection, then the book becomes the precious artifact, and people don't see it as just a book anymore. You know? That's it. I mean, we're not there yet, but the music stores got there, and I think the bookstores can too.
So some of the things you're trying to incorporate in this discussion, some of it that you're really hoping that more children will do poetry. I'm a nature lover. Mary Oliver is one of my favorite poets.
Yeah.
And to me, because our children are so isolated from almost everything that should arouse their interest, it's hard to visualize how they're going to know what's a chickadee, what's a chipmunk. I mean, you know, I raised my daughter to be outdoors, and I love books. She was reading all the time. We were reading all the time. She came home from school when she was 9 years old, and they'd given her a stanza from The Story of Lucy Gray by Williams Wordsworth, and she'd memorized the whole poem. She went back to school the next day, and she wanted to recite the whole thing, and we said, we don't have time for it. I have a video of her. She recited the entire Cremation of Sam McGee when she was 9 years old. But that's because she was outside, she was exploring things, she was, you know, and I gave her that environment. And I don't know how many parents are interested in that, or have, you know, I made myself have the time for that, and she's published, you know, she's published.
We got a guy in town here who specializes in doing Robert Service, you know, recitations.
Yeah.
He's a local treasure, because there are very few people like that around.
Yeah.
And he just does fabulous renditions of them, and I just wish every town, it's like a town storyteller, a town crier. I wish everybody did something like that.
I grew up with my grandmother taking us on walks. This was a long time ago, and recite, because everybody, that's how you learn stuff with prose. And I still remember those walks, and she just start reciting someone, and so that's where.
My grandmother that I did the poem for, she was an English and Latin teacher. And I remember when I was about 8, 9 years old, she took me to see Robert Frost. At Middlebury College in Vermont. And, yeah, and I just remember this icon. I remember this icon on the stage, you know, and then he turns around and does, you know, the Kennedy inauguration, you know, after that. And but this voice, and I have a recording of his voice. There's a poetry collection, a CD collection, and a whole book with authors doing their poetry. Robert Frost is one of them. His old, I mean, if you ever heard Douglas MacArthur, like, you know, I shall return speech or whatever it is, but, you know, that old gravelly voice, Robert Frost is like that. And when you read a poem like Stopping by Woods or Mending Wall or something like that, you know, you're right there. And that was where I started to get my love for nature and the word, and the descriptions that I have come up with is really based on that. And you look at the world with an observation in your eye instead of like, oh, I have this blank piece of paper, this pen, I'm back in school, and they're telling me to write. They're not telling me to look. They're not telling me to observe, just like, you know, your poem. You know, they're not telling me, like, well, why not? And all my years of, I've only been retired 2 years, and all my years of teaching students, boy, it was nature pictures, old calendars, paint chips, you know, paint chips you get at the store, beautiful descriptions for colors on that. And I just like write down what you see. And then they started to write into a poetic form that they didn't realize they were going to write. And going back to what you were saying, Tommy, about the young children with rhyming poetry, last month I was in a first grade up in Denver. Well, it was March. We were doing Dr. Seuss's birthday. Boy, we were just popping rhymes off the top of our heads, just like that. And the kids were with me. But don't ask me to sit down and do a rhyming poem and have it to be, it's no Robert Louis Stevenson or anything like that. I can get very Seuss-like once a year on March 2nd. And that's it. Other than that, I feel like I'm back, you know, with my reading group, you know, with my fourth graders, but that's not what I want my, you know, writing to be about. But that sort of thing is a lot of fun. And I think that if we go back to, you know, looking at our first memories of poems, and it's our nursery rhymes and walks with grandmother or things like that, that I think poetry has a very tender place in our hearts, whether we realize it or not. And it may not be the popular in thing, or maybe up there, you know, you're right, you don't see a poetry book in the top, you know, New York Times bestsellers. And I remember down at Pikes Peak Writing Conference, the first one I went to, what did I know talking to an agent from New York, and he's like, you know, don't waste your time writing poetry, I'll never sell. I turned around and I New Yorked him back as I could, being a native New Yorker, and I said, watch me, just watch me. And I was more determined that I wanted to write my style and get it out. I did publish Journey On, I self-published it. We did it as you know, as a family adventure. My son helped design the book. An artist up in Larkspur did the painting. It wasn't an intentional painting for the cover. It was one that I found at Wisdom Tea House here in town during Art Hop last summer, and I took it off the wall. I was like, this would make a beautiful cover. And so there's a local artist that has done this. She has also done another painting that I've swooping up for the second volume. And you can call it a limited edition. There aren't 3,000 copies sitting in the garage, but I did it. And I don't have to go, I mean, I'm not on the corner hawking them just to get rid of them, but I print them when I need them. And my printer is Tattered Cover Bookstore with their electronic bookmaking machine up in Denver.
We met the manager of that division in Spain while we were traveling.
Wow. He took my book there.
Yeah, so he probably had your
yes,
book.
I heard he bought the book. John Sack.
Yeah.
How did you meet him?
On the plane. Just random.
Because he bought my book.
No, there's no random, right?
Yeah, he bought my book right before he left, and he wanted it for a conference, and he just got back last week.
Yeah.
I didn't know Journey On went to Spain.
You're international.
So does anybody else have any other questions for our panelists?
Well, I have just, kind of your opinion on, poetry in a book is black on white. What do you think about illustrating your poetry as part of your, as part of the book? Did that detract from the imagery that you should get from reading the words, or?
Well, 3 of my poems, as you know, the guy back there with the questions I'm married to. You'll get it later on. Never plant somebody in the audience unless you put it right. Anyway, Corn Silk is being made into a picture book for children. And I am seeking an illustrator. The pictures I envision is very, I want them in like soft watercolors, nothing harsh, nothing digital at all. And looking at others like poets or songwriters that have done poetry books, like Blowing in the Wind is a poetry book by Bob Dylan. I mean, yes, he wrote the words, even though Peter Paul sang them better than he did. But it's a beautiful book. And so you're looking at song lyrics as a poetry book. It comes off really well. Peter Yarrow did Puff the Magic Dragon. It's a classic children's story now as a picture book. So that's what's on tap with that. If you do well in getting good imagery in your poem or your writing, you shouldn't have, well, no, I'm not going to say you shouldn't have to illustrate it. No.
However,
No. It's great to accompany it, any more than like a photography book with poetry that you can do. But your poem,
don't make it to where the illustration is necessary to
yeah,
understand it.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Okay,
And
I know, you're talking about slam poetry, and I'm sitting here thinking about my youth because I used to love to take elocution lessons. Have you ever heard of them? Where you just stand up on the stage, you memorize, and then you act it
yes.
out. And you have to memorize real well, and then you can kind of walk across the stage or demonstrate it and then bring that story to life. Is that kind of like something?
Yeah, very, very similar. There's a lot of fast activity, and there's time limits, 3 minutes, for a poem and all that kind of stuff. But the concept is very similar to elocution because really you're trying to bring a prose poem or a standard poem to life through a whole series of actions and memorize.
Well, thank you very much. I thought we'd maybe give another 15 minutes for anyone who would like to read another poem, or if not, and then if no one wants to, that's fine. Nancy is going to be signing her books at the end of the evening. So if anyone would like to go up and say another poem, please feel free. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.